Public Authorities Fraud, Error and Recovery Bill.
Right, we're now in public session and proceedings are being broadcast. Before I begin, I'd like to remind members to switch off their electronic devices or switch them to silent, and that tea and coffee are forbidden. We have three motions to consider. First, the programme motion on the amendment paper. Then we'll consider a motion to enable reporting of written evidence for publication. And third, a motion to allow us to deliberate in private. In view of the very tight timetable, honourable members may wish to take those motions formally without debate. I call the Minister to move the programme motion standing in his name, which was discussed by the programming subcommittee yesterday.
Formally.
Formally. The question is that the programme motion on the amendment paper be made. As many of that opinion will say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. The ayes have it, the ayes have it. I call the Minister to move the motion about written evidence.
Move formally.
The question is the motion on the amendment paper. As many of that opinion will say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. The ayes have it, the ayes have it. Copies of written evidence which the committee receives will be made available in the committee room. I call the Minister now to move the motion about deliberating in private.
Move formally.
The question is as on the order paper. As many of those of that opinion will say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. The ayes have it, the ayes have it. So now we go into private session to discuss the order of questions, or who's going to ask questions. In public session and proceedings are being broadcast. Before we hear from the witnesses, are any honourable members wishing to declare interests that are pertinent to the bill?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to declare an interest as both a member of Nottinghamshire County Council and Gedling Borough Council currently, which are both responsible for administering benefits.
Thank you.
Exactly the same. A member of Gedling Borough Council and Nottinghamshire County Council who have responsibility for administering benefits.
Thank you.
In the same vein, I'm a member of Plymouth City Council.
Very good.
Trustee, Director of Southwark Charities, who provide accommodation for some older people who may be affected by the provisions of this bill, but that's
Thank you.
a cursory reference, really.
Right. We will now hear oral evidence from Professor Mark Button, Dr. Rasha Kassem, and Professor Michael Levi. Before calling the first member to ask a question, I remind members that questions should be limited to matters within the scope of the bill. It's vital that we stick to the timings, which are tight, and which the committee has agreed. And this panel lasts till 10:10 at the outside. Could the witnesses briefly introduce themselves?
Good morning, everybody. My name is Professor Mark Button. I'm co-director of the Centre for Cybercrime and Economic Crime at the University of Portsmouth, and I've been researching fraud-related issues for nearly 20 years.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Dr. Rasha Kassem, Senior Lecturer and Leader of the Fraud Research Group at Aston University. And like Mark, but probably less years, researching fraud, all aspects of it.
I'm Michael Levi. I'm Professor of Criminology at Cardiff, and I've actually been researching fraud for 53 years. So I think I win on that score. But that may mean I'm very out of date.
Mike Wood.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. If I could start just by asking the panel a reasonably general question as to what, in your experience, are the main limiting factors in investigating public sector fraud? Who wants to start?
Well, I think there's a number of factors. Obviously, the first challenge with dealing with social security fraud and a lot of the rest of the public sector fraud is you don't have a choice to deal with them. It's not like a bank or a private company where they have the opportunity to decide whether or not to do business with that particular person, and they can make a decision based upon that. So they have to, in the case of someone making a claim for benefit, they have to deal with that person. You're obviously dealing with increasingly highly organised fraudsters that often operate across borders. That poses significant challenges, particularly for many of the public sector fraud agencies to deal with that, particularly when the police themselves have very limited resources. Less than 2,000 officers who are dedicated towards economic crime, who simply don't have the time to help public sector bodies deal with these types of things. So I think when you look at those particular challenges, having a professional capacity within government to investigate fraud with the appropriate powers is a kind of sound basis for dealing with these problems.
I would say the capabilities and skills of public authority staff. That would be a main challenge for me. Do they have the same understanding about what fraud means, its impact, and the methodologies and typologies of fraud, and the limitations of each type as well? Because when you talk about fraud, you talk about fraud committed by individuals as well as organizations against the public sector. The procedures can't be the same in each case, and also the motivations and the resources will not be the same in each case. So they have to have this understanding, equally the understanding about the differentiation between fraud and error, because the element of intent to deceive is the main differentiating factor. Do we have a criteria that tells, like, stuff in the public sector, how to differentiate between fraud and error? Is that like an agreed upon criteria to ensure that errors are not happening? Are they trained and having the proper skills to enable them to investigate without accusing, for example, innocent people and impacting adversely, like, vulnerable individuals? This would be the main challenge in my case.
And one final quick point, because I know there's a lot of questions. At the one extreme, there's the point that Mark made about organised crime groups, etc. But it's identifying when something is a kind of organised crime activity, which you can only do easily either by getting intelligence or by correlating the claimants' data with each other to build up a pattern, as in COVID-19 fraud schemes. And at the other extreme, there's probably the majority of failure to notify change in circumstance, which has always been the most common part of the DWP's area. As far as the Public Sector Fraud Authority goes, I think it's identifying a lot of internal cases from people that you wouldn't ordinarily suspect.
I think all three of you suggested at least that PSFA would be a positive step in tackling some of those challenges. Are there any gaps in the legislation that you think it could or should have gone further, something that should have been in there that seems to be missing?
Well, I think one of the key things is always resources. And if you look at the size of the PFSA at the moment in terms of the scale of fraud, and you look at some of their estimates, it's substantially more than the estimates of fraud in the DWP. So having a relatively small unit as what's proposed, I think is a limitation. So I think for me the key thing is having the appropriate resources within that unit to actually have a real impact on fraud. And I think asking that question of is there enough there at the moment, I think is a key one.
For me, I believe, although it's a very positive step and definitely will enhance accountability, there are several things that need to be considered. To start, again, the definition of fraud can be a little bit limiting in the current bill, because first it assumes that fraud is happening for financial reasons when it's not necessarily the case. There are non-financial motives, and if you consider insider fraud committed by insiders, people working for the public authorities, which is one of the most common threats, not just in the public sector, but across the other sectors as well. A disgruntled employee can be as dangerous as someone seeking financial motive here. So again, I would stick with the Fraud Act definition of fraud 2006, because it mentions personal gain full stop. It can be financial and it can be non-financial, so this has to be clarified. Also, the difference between fraud and error. I know that the intent there is mentioned, rightly so, as the main differentiating factor between fraud and error. However, again, we have to be very clear about the criteria that would enable public sector staff to differentiate between fraud and error, because you don't want them to make mistakes, accuse innocent individuals of committing fraud, just like what happened in the office scandal as well, and that would cause further repetition damage to the Public Sector Fraud Authority and the public sector in general. So they have to be very careful about the criteria, has to be agreed upon criteria. The second area I'm going to talk about is, again, because there is a difference between fraud and error, the recovery and the procedures in terms of perpetrators committing fraud versus those committing error need to be clarified in the bill. At the moment, I don't think that is clear enough. The third point is understanding the very nature of fraud, the fact that fraud can be committed by individuals and organizations, and the policies and procedures that will be followed when you deal with fraud committed by individuals should not be the same as when you deal with organizations. For example, if you were to take preventive measures, the procedures would be different from for organizations versus individuals. With organizations, you're talking about controls, you're talking about compliance measures, etc., etc. So this has to be clarified in the bill. Fraud committed by organizations and how this will be dealt with versus fraud committed by individuals. The last point I would like to raise is about the possibility of abuse of power here, because, again, the PSFA, although they have greater intentions of preventing fraud, you don't want, at least in appearance, in front of the public, to show that there is less risk of abuse of position there. So the oversight board would be very important there, an independent body, perhaps an independent board from the PSFA staff looking or overseeing the work. For this to work, there has to be proper governance structures board members who are independent, having proper fraud expertise, understanding the limitations and the mission of the public authorities, and reporting from the public authorities will be very important about their operational performance to enable that independent board to oversee properly would be important.
I don't quite agree with all those comments. I think some of those don't need to be in the bill, but they obviously need to be part of the structure, because the bill will last, hopefully, for a long time, and I'm sure you're all familiar with changes. I do think the point about the resource is important, but also you need to allow time for bedding in. You know, the issue about where they're going to recruit staff from, how experienced in actually dealing with stuff they are. I remember the Asset Recovery Agency was a standalone body which was closed down because it didn't recover at that time because there were so many appeals as much as it cost. Now, this is not quite analogous with that, but one needs to see this in terms of years to develop skills in actually handling cases. So I don't think that's so much a question of the limitations of the bill, but I think it is a kind of a warning about not expecting too rapid results. Obviously the practitioners and policymakers may offer a different view from mine, but I think it does take quite a long time. When I reviewed the Serious Fraud Office for the Royal Commission in 1992, this whole issue of expertise in actually dealing with stuff takes quite a while. Some would argue it hasn't yet done that.
Question. Obviously, the government's impact assessment recognises that some will change their behaviours to circumvent checks. How easy do you think it would be to close those loopholes that allow some to get around the checks, and would that be a proportionate response?
I think with any kind of initiative like this, you're always going to get a degree of displacement. You know, the clever fraudsters will find new means to get around the rules. But obviously a lot of these measures are directed at the more, if you like, opportunistic individuals who are not as well organised and probably don't invest as much time in looking for means to get around some of those measures. So I think for that sort of, if you like, client group of offenders, then I think, you know, this will be quite effective. But I think for the more organised, and particularly for the more organised crime elements, they will find ways to get around some of these measures.
And I'm not sure that I'm not myself clear about what the provisions are for international linkages in the bill. Perhaps that's something that just needs to be sorted out afterwards. But people will need to be able to chase money overseas, and question about who does that and what do they need to do before they're able to do that is pretty important, because not so much in COVID-19 frauds, because that's already happened, but a lot of these things are quite time critical, and the asset freezing orders that were granted to the police in 2017 have proven very effective. So we need to think about, well, what are the processes for dealing with this stuff rapidly?
It's just one final point that, I raised before the issue about differentiating between fraud committed by individuals and organisations, and I think this needs to be sorted in the bill, not afterwards, because, for example, from a governance perspective, in the bill you say you can access bank accounts and freeze assets of whom? Are you going to take the assets from the organisation, or is it going to be the directors running the organisation, or the fraud perpetrators inside the organisation? This has to be sorted, because you will be faced by another issue, at least in courts, saying who's the controlling mind in the organisation. The organisation has a mind of its own legally, and therefore it cannot be treated the same way as when you deal directly with individuals. If this is sorted, then there will be hopefully higher probability of recovery and less loopholes in the bill.
There's also the question of legal aid for those suspected or accused who have to take some measures to appeal. I wasn't clear about that. That may be my fault, but.
Neil? Neil Coyle.
Come back in on this point about fraud and error and the differentiation between organised fraud and individuals. Are you saying that needs to be more clearly defined? I think there's a slight difference on the panel potentially, but Dr. Kassem, you were saying there needs to be greater clarity in the bill, and then Professor Levi, you were saying some bits don't need to be in the bill. Are you saying they need to be in the guidance? I was a bit confused.
Do you want to clarify?
Well, I'm not sure it needs to be in the bill. Definitions of what we mean by organised are typically vague. An act committed by three or more people for the pursuit of profit is a very low bar for organised crime. But a fraud by one person can be perfectly well organised, but it's not part of an organised crime group. As in policing, we normally talk about organised crime activity. People normally think about organised crime groups. So I think that's a definitional problem that may be a little bit too much for the bill and indeed for governments in its present form. But they certainly need to think about, and I'm sure they have, about what conditions apply to which people. I'm not sure whether that constraint needs to be in the bill. Dr. Rasha may have a different view.
Yeah, because for me, when I talk about fraud committed by organisations, it doesn't have to be organised crime. It could be a legitimate organisation defrauding the public sector. So, again, like in the bill, you mention things around recovery, accessing bank accounts, like seizing assets, how this will apply in the case of organisation versus individual. This needs to be thought carefully about in the bill because, again, when you think about the nature of fraud and who's committing it, you're talking about different powers here, different motives of individuals versus organisations, different assets and different ways of recovery. They are not the same, and therefore this has to be clarified in the bill.
And to be clear, there's no suggestion that someone who has received, for example, child benefit when their child reaches 18, if they fail to notify change of circumstances, there's no suggestion that that would be considered fraud in this legislation.
Well, it depends. Have they knowingly know that? Because the differentiating factor between fraud and error is the intent.
I think they know the date of birth of the child. But so does the Department for Work and Pensions. And I just think that the distinction is whether that is an error in relating to updating your record with the department or whether that is a deliberate act of fraud in continuing to receive a payment that you're not entitled to.
Yes, and that's why...
But my question is, are you saying that needs to be clearer in the legislation or guidance potentially, listening to Professor Levi?
Yes, in terms of the intent, yes, because errors could happen. How can you... the differentiating factor between fraud and error is the intent to deceive. As the example you mentioned, this case could be an error or it could be fraud depending on the intent to deceive here. And therefore, there has to be clear criteria in the bill to at least guide stuff in the public sector to differentiate between fraud and error.
But sticking with that example, it's also an error on the department's part to continue making a payment when someone has reached an age where they're not entitled to receive.
Yeah.
So does that distinction need to be in there, that there needs to be the flexibility to treat on an individual basis? Sorry, Professor.
I was just going to say, my son recently reached 18 and went to university, and my wife received a letter saying, unless you have these circumstances, you have to actually positively say that they're staying on in further education. So there would be a clear misrepresentation. I think would not be an opportunity for an error on that particular example, based on my experience of what my son just went.
If the 18-year-old went into work. So, but the point is, the onus is on the individual to make clear the change of circumstances to the department. But the department also has the opportunity to question. In your case, you're showing that the department has done that.
They sent a letter and you had to fill a form in to say that your son was staying on in further education to continue receiving.
To reduce the fudge. So it's sometimes difficult to see how there can be a legitimate explanation in the case that you're rightly using. But there must be a possibility of arguing that, and I'm not sure myself that needs to be in the bill. That's a matter of criminal law, which the bill doesn't seek to change in this case. But but in most departmental behaviour, they'll adjust, and Mark's son's case is a perfect example where they've clarified so that if they continued claiming under those circumstances, it would be clear that they committed an offence.
Good luck to Mark's son University. Can I just ask one more question, Chair? Is that all right? Sorry, I do. It was Professor Levy's point about previous experience in organisations being closed down because of appeals and things. Is there a need for this bill to retain the flexibility in the potential to give bodies new powers over time where challenges arise in either recouping money that's been stolen or challenging potentially fraudulent behaviour?
Yeah, I mean, I'm enthusiastic about the extension to 12 years of the limitations. I think that's very sensible, particularly if you have the length of time that has elapsed since COVID-19. But I'm not sure how you do how you insert something in the bill that would enable it to be varied. I mean, who presumably Parliament would like to see those proposals before they're approved. But the issue about parliamentary time, or it could be done by supplemental issues. But I think it's right that very few people envisage the future. Look at the impact of technologies in our time. To envisage the future that people will find ways of getting around things that you haven't thought of yet is pretty normal.
Thanks. Thank you, Sir Desmond, and thank you very much for joining us today. If I could just ask Dr. Kassem a question, just for my own understanding. We've talked a lot about the definition of fraud and error and the department's approach to fraud and error, and on the DWP side, we're not, to my knowledge, planning to change the definition that we have that within the scope of the bill, but clearly we're taking new powers to enforce against that. But just out of interest, is there an academically accepted definition of fraud versus error that people work to, or is it ultimately a question of judgment?
Well, there are lots of definitions talking about fraud, including lies and cheating and misrepresentation for personal gain. But my point is, personal gain can be financial or non-financial. The bill specifically mentioned financial gain. But what would you do if, you have a staff member working for a public authority and allowed access, for example, unauthorized access, or sold information out of revenge, for example? Well, there's no financial gain in that case. Would you treat that as fraud?
And could I just ask one more? So I'm interested in your views on societal attitudes to fraud. Clearly, we've seen a significant increase in fraud and error within the DWP since the pandemic, so around £35 billion lost in total, upwards of £7 billion lost to fraud itself last year alone. We hear an awful lot about the changing attitudes that people have towards fraud. Is that something that you've seen, recognised and acknowledged, and are there other drivers that you think are behind those increased numbers?
Yes, I've seen that in the literature, but not in practice yet. And I think the way to go forward with that is by education, raising awareness about fraud and its impact, because those individuals committing fraud, they don't see the harm there. They see the government as having lots of money, rich country, and they see themselves entitled as well more than others, and they take their fair share, or they can do it out of revenge, ideology, coercion perhaps. So there are lots of motivations for them to do that. So by educating them about why this is wrong and what would be the consequences of committing fraud, that can help reduce fraud over, the long term, raising awareness about it, but equally important, training staff in public authorities about fraud, what it means and how to detect it. Prevention is better than a cure. So again, it has to go hand in hand. Yes, there has to be investigation, there has to be deterrent to discourage people from doing it. And this bill is an excellent step in doing so. However, if you produce the bill with untrained staff members who are not able to identify fraud criminals individually or organizationally, there will be, it will not really work. So everything, it's like preventing fraud requires a holistic approach. You can't just focus on prevention alone or on enhancing accountability alone or on deterrence or investigation. Everything needs to work together, and education play an important part internally in public sectors and externally across the public members.
I've recently done some research where we replicated a study from 10 years ago, and we sought a representative sample of the population and their attitudes to various deviant behaviours, including benefits fraud, and we found there was a significant decline in honesty. So I think there are changes that are particularly pronounced amongst younger people, and I think it's been driven by a whole range of factors. Not least, it's much more easier to be dishonest now. If you go back 20, 30 years, if you wanted to apply for a loan or a credit card, you had to go to a bank. Now you just do it online on a computer. It's much easier to engage in dishonest behaviours in those types of ways. And I think the other thing is that social media and different types of forums provide opportunities for people to discuss how to engage in dishonest behaviour. I'm doing some research at the moment about online refund fraud, and we've been going into forums where a wide range of individuals are discussing how to defraud retailers and get, refunds for stuff that they've bought online. I strongly suspect that kind of thing's probably also going on for benefits fraud. So all of those factors are just making it much easier. So I think there is a much more significant challenge for not just the public sector but private sector organisations in dealing with fraud because of that.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of scope for unchallenged behaviour. Now, who gets challenged by people, and if you don't have face-to-face relationships, then the opportunities for moral education are much less. So, personally, I think there needs to be a lot more in schools, but there's a lack of capacity in the school's curriculum for this kind of thing, but also avoiding being victims and discussions about money muling and other. So there's a kind of broader spectrum of behaviours where people can get involved in fraud that we need to look at collectively.
Thank you, and thanks for bringing your significant experience to this discussion. My question was building on Dr. Rasha's point about the importance of oversight, and I think that's something that we've taken very seriously in drafting the bill and trying to ensure that independent oversight is built into every part. And I'd be really interested in all of the witnesses' kind of assessment of the level of oversight that's built in, and as we develop the kind of further work and guidance and training, anything we need to be thinking about to continue to strengthen that.
I think if you look at this in the broader context of, one of my areas of studies is hybrid policing bodies, sort of non-police bodies that engage in a whole range of enforcement functions. What has been proposed in terms of the accountability of this body compared to, say, the Health and Safety Executive, Gang Masters, Licensing Authority, some of the many other different types of enforcement bodies, is certainly on a par, if not better, than some of those organisations, with the kind of the inspection, with the complaints body that they have access to, and the additional measures they have in place. I think one of the crucial areas is obviously when you get to prosecutions, and obviously we've seen with the post office scandal the challenges there if you have too much control over prosecution as well. Obviously the DWP does use the CPS, but I think obviously with the lesser sanctions there might be an issue to have maybe more accountability where you've got that situation to avoid excessive use of those penalties in a very negative way. So that's possibly the only area I would see an issue. I think otherwise the accountability measures are very similar to many other hybrid enforcement bodies that the central government have.
Side, in order to recover debt, you'd have to apply to a court to do so. So does that answer that point, or do you think there's more that needs to be done?
Yes, I think that does. That's fine. That
okay.
part.
Thank you.
And HMI CIFAS have been pretty tough on fraud policing by the police. So I'm personally encouraged by the proposal for accountability, for review by them. And, it's pretty reasonably rigorous scientific, and there's the NAO as well. But so I think sampling behaviours at all levels, following on from Professor Button's comments, is a good methodology for testing that. I think the question about the Dr. Kassem was raising earlier about the internal stuff and supervision of that is a more complex example. I don't know if you want, rather than me speaking for you.
Yeah, it's okay. So my suggestion was more about having an independent oversight board, for example, independent from the PSFA to review the work and also to perhaps support an independent audit of the operations. And see if the bill is actually working, in terms of recovery, in terms of transparency and fairness. Someone might say, okay, we need someone from the PSFA on the board to feedback about, operational tasks and challenges, etc., which is fair enough, but this could slightly reduce the independence we're talking about. They can still produce a report to describe the work, the performance, the challenges that they met, and a completely independent board can then oversee the work and challenge it, scrutinise it if needed.
So the proposal is to have an independent that is completely independent of a PSFA that reports into Parliament. So do you think that
yes.
that kind of talks to, that answers
yes.
that? Okay, brilliant.
Yeah.
It was really reassuring to hear that, because I think oversight is incredibly important to us. I have one more question, but I'm happy to give way if others...
May I come back in? Just on the specific point of independent oversight as it pertains to the DWP element. So obviously we are intending to put in place an independent person to oversee the eligibility verification measure, and then HMICFRS on both search and seizure and information gathering. Are you satisfied with that as a proposal for independent oversight on the DWP side, or are there things that you would ask us to consider beyond that?
I personally recommend a board rather than an individual, because how sustainable that could be, and also again who's going to audit the individual. So you want an unbiased point of view, and that's what could happen when you have independent experts, discussing the matter and sharing their points of view. You don't want this to be dictated by an individual again, who might take longer as well to look at the process, and the operations are going to be slower. We don't want that from a governance perspective. If you want to oversee things in an effective way, then a board would be a much better idea.
I think the only thing I'd add on the DWP is it's likely to be much more resource intensive. There's likely to be a lot more cases, so having an appropriate capacity, I think, is important for that.
Yes, I agree with that. I mean, historically, I'd say in relation to, say, asset forfeiture, the problem has been one of excessive caution rather than too much activity And there have been a lot of legal challenges that still remain. I was on the Cabinet Office Committee that sort of set that up. So I think there can be too much governance of that. So it's a tension between having a lot of governance in place and saying, look, can we get on with it?
Just briefly, because I'm conscious of the time, I was just very interested in what Professor Button was talking about in terms of the encouraging people to commit fraud and the kind of particularly the rise of online videos and TikTok and all of that sort of thing. So I was just wondering briefly whether you think enough is done in the bill to allow for going after people who are choosing to do that, because that's essentially a fraud in itself, and also whether this is a good example of where the distinction between fraud and error blurs, because ultimately if there's no education on what fraud is and people are watching lots of social media videos of how to defraud things, does that become error or do we have it as fraud? So I'm just interested in whether we're inadvertently not tackling those kind of root issues through the bill, and whether there's anything that we could do to make sure that that's tougher.
Yeah, well, I think it is really important to kind of tackle those areas. I'm not sure whether it's something that needs to go specifically in the bill. I think it's more an issue of giving the body the capacity to go after those types of individuals and to work with other relevant policing agencies, where I suspect that would need to be the case, to deal with that, rather than specifically saying those types of things in the law. I suppose, obviously we've got the Online Safety Act now, and that covers a lot of areas, and whether that would be useful enough, or the specific Fraud Act in terms of, if you like, and the historic conspiracy to engage in fraud, whether that would be appropriate, or whether you actually need to create a new specific offence of, promoting social security fraud online. I wouldn't like to comment on that. That's probably something that needs more thought. But I think the key thing is more enforcement of that and disrupting those kinds of forums, where that kind of discussion is taking place.
I think there's also the issue of signalling to people where the boundaries lie. So I would say it's not so much an issue for the bill, but I think for enforcement practice across not just for these agencies, but across the board, of how you need some condign activities that communicate to people via social media as well as the old media that we may read. What is acceptable, what is legal, and what isn't. The NCA have actually been pretty good about that in the cybercrime area in trying to educate people to divert them away from crime, and I think there's some good lessons across, but it's also a question of resource and just how many such things people can deal with.
A question, if that's okay, Chair. I just wondered, in your experience, kind of researching fraud, looking internationally, kind of how this bill compares to other international best practice, and anything else we should be considering that you've seen that particularly works in other places.
Well, the Americans used to be better at this than may have been the case in the last few weeks. But so the General Accounting Office and some of the Inspectorates General in the US have been pretty active, but nevertheless the US still had a huge amount of COVID-19 fraud. Australians kind of getting better. Clearly, the head of the PSFA is part of this kind of group of people all trying to improve things. But I would say we're starting at a pretty modest level in terms of numbers of people. I think in terms of DWP, it's a struggle for everybody. I think you've got to look at it in relation to the general welfare I remember going to a meeting and talking to some French delegates who said to me, it was about...
Order.
Yeah.
That brings us to the end of the allotted time for this panel. Can I thank the witnesses very much for their evidence, and we'll move on to the next panel. Are you ready to go on first? Oh, we're down to one.
There was one.
Right, well, we'll now hear evidence from Helena Wood, Director of Public Policy and Strategic Engagement at CIFAS and a Fellow of the Royal United Services Institute. Mike Wood.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Welcome, Ms. Wood. Obviously, a lot of the discussion on the first panel was around the balance between effectiveness and proportionality. How well do you think the bill, as it's currently drafted, strikes that balance?
I'm finding it quite difficult to comment on that, given that we were yet to see the code of practice, and I feel a lot of burden's been placed on that code of practice as it stands to build in some of that proportionality. I know the government have committed to consulting on that code of practice forthwith, but without seeing that, I think a lot of it hinges in how those powers will be used in practice. Without that being known to me at present, I would quite like to see something pulled up actually into the face of the bill to build in proportionality by design. At the moment, both on the PFSA side and on the DWP eligibility powers, verification powers, it's a very blunt instrument as it stands. And I think the law would do well to pull up those measures of proportionality up into the face of the bill. We have to look at this bill in its broader context, and it very much unintentionally stands at that ideological debate between the rights of the individual to privacy and the rights of society as a whole to benefit from the funds that are available to fund essential public services. And I think we have to kind of deal with both of those arguments with due caution and due respect. And as it stands, the bill tends to be quite blunt in the way it's going to be proposed on the face of the bill, and I'd like to see a lot more from that code of practice and how it will be built in. And beyond that, I think I'd like to see a lot more about the people who will be using these powers. Again, as it stands, we trust the police to use their coercive and intrusive powers based on their skills, experience and training. At the moment, there's a reasonably low bar set in the legislation as it stands, and that's merely to be a HEO or SEO, a very entry-grade civil service officer. Other coercive powers that we can see across areas I've studied across the course of a 20-year career, particularly in the Proceeds of Crime Act, require some professional skills where one is not a police officer. One must be a trained financial investigator, a trained and accredited role that's overseen by statute. Here, the bar and the competence of the individuals using that power and the trust we can thus place in them to use those powers proportionally is quite limited.
And so if we're looking at moving some of those standards onto the face of the bill for questions such as reasonableness, is there a recognised definition or test for reasonableness that you think could be incorporated into this bill?
It depends which part of the bill we're talking about. I think this is very much a sort of game of two halves. I mean, some of for example, the PSFA powers, they mirror powers that are used almost as standard across the landscape of counter financial crime. I think we can be more comfortable about the use of those powers. The power I have more concerns about is something that's very new and is incredibly intrusive and without limitation to it being a civil or criminal investigation. It's the DWP eligibility verification powers. I think there we need to proceed with more caution about how they are used, given this is very much at risk of being a blanket phishing style power without any recourse to the limitation and bars that others have to reach to use other powers, which would be either a civil or criminal investigation. And I think that part of the bill requires a little more thought and a little more of that proportionality pulling up front, unless the government can bring forward that code of practice to allow those of you around the room judging this bill to see what will be in that code of practice to limit the use of those powers to only the highest risk of high-end investigations rather than being a blanket power.
And so given both the extent and potential impact of those powers that you're referring to, would it be your view that either some further oversight or potentially appeal mechanism would be appropriate to help safeguard those interests?
Absolutely. So I think the concerns I have about these powers are the collateral intrusion. I mean, I think we can all agree that the quality of data, both on the DWP side and on the part of financial institutions, is not always as good as it could be. I completely agree with the need to minimise the level of information that those institutions are giving back to the DWP to caution against intrusion, necessary intrusions upon privacy. But I'd like to see a very, a minimum standard of data match that will be required to take action on that data. If we're only giving a minimum a piece of information back from the banks into the DWP, how do we know that that's an absolute specific match on the individuals they have on their system? And without seeing the information about how that will be acted upon in the code of practice, I'm slightly cautious about that. I think we need to see that detail earlier rather than later for you to be able to make that judgment about the risks of unintended consequences of this legislation. I mean, let's look at it in its broader context again. This is a very intrusive power, but it sits in a suite of other measures and powers available to investigators across the system. What we don't want to do with this power is bring those other powers into disrepute, and we have to apply this with due caution, make sure that match is a match, and I'd like to see which specific data points will be available to the DWP investigator to ensure this is a match and not to minimise the risk of collateral intrusion.
Thank you very much.
Minister.
Thank you, Sir Desmond. Just on the specific point that you made, Helena, around scope and the level of intrusion associated with the eligibility verification measure, I think you said that you would like to see the power restricted to the most serious investigations, which from our perspective kind of would run contrary to what we are trying to achieve in terms of capturing the data that would enable us to identify those whom we have no idea that they are committing fraud or in receipt of an overpayment, albeit unwittingly. Is there another way that you think that we could achieve that?
It's a very good question, but I think it goes back to that point of the balance between individual rights to privacy and the society's rights as a whole, and only you can make the decision about where that balance falls. And what I'd like to see is much more, I think, going back to the previous question, perhaps built in some more into the oversight of that use of that power, a specific requirement for the independent reviewer to look at instances of collateral intrusion and where mistakes have been made and to report on those to Parliament. If we can build that into the code of practice, and again, forgive me for coming back to that code of practice, but I think a lot of the use of this power hinges on how it will be used in practice and by whom, and I think we need to build some significant guardrails against that. The second point I would make is, are we really sure? I think this is, to my knowledge, an unprecedented power internationally. How can we be sure this is going to be effective in practice? So, for example, we know that individuals rarely have one bank account in one institution anymore. In fact, there's numerous pieces of research, and forgive me, I don't have the figures in my head, but I can refer those back to the committee. Individuals now have masses of bank accounts across 5, 6, 7, up to 10, 20 institutions. By targeting them at one institution to get that, are you really going to get that full picture anyway? So how effective is this to, if this is to be proportionate, we have to be clear that intrusion is in fact proportionate and it's going to be effective in practice. I'm yet to see the evidence that it is. If it's used in a scattergun way, and that's why it'd be great to build into that code of practice something much more targeted around risk. For example, high-risk postcodes that are coming through in intelligence, for example, around organised crime attacks on the benefit system might be one way to look at that.
So I think part of the reason that we don't have specific intent to look at organised crime with this is that organised crime makes up less than 10% of the fraud that we see within the department at the moment, or certainly the overall fraud and error figures. I'm kind of reflecting on your comments about balance, but then hearing the questions around efficacy by only going to look directly into one financial institution's accounts. For me, the concern about broadening that is one of scope, and we've taken significant steps when set against previous proposals in this area to narrow the scope of the bill. So, for instance, we are initially looking only at the 3 benefits where we see the highest levels of fraud and error. So universal credit is obviously principal amongst those. But the work that we have done to narrow the scope, does that reassure you at all when you look at this? For instance, the removal of the state pension, the restriction to only one financial institution, because clearly without that we would have to look at every single bank account in the country in detail and investigate why every single person in the country has £16,000 if we're not able to see across the full range of bank accounts that they have.
Absolutely. If I can answer that question in 2 parts, if I may. So, yes, absolutely. So, if we compare this to the predecessor bill put forward by the previous government, I think the concerns of all that has been listened to, much more significant oversight, much more limited scope, and I think if we're looking at that in comparison to a predecessor bill, absolutely. To your question around the second part of that, that I think you make a very good point around this isn't always organised crime, and I'd build on a point made by my predecessors giving evidence. This is absolutely what we would refer to as a first-party fraud-driven approach. We're seeing huge. At CIFAS, we run a fraud behaviour survey every year, again questioning individuals about their general attitudes around fraud, individual level-driven fraud, and we see those numbers ticking up year on year about what is deemed acceptable by individuals. So your point's well made and fully made around the rising levels of first-party fraud. I think we do have to look at it as both a first-party fraud and an organised fraud response.
Thank you. And if I may just ask one more, just around the the current systems that we have in place, what do you perceive are the principal weaknesses in the DWP's current powers to detect fraud?
Again, a really good point is made, and I think others will probably, who follow me on this committee evidence session, will make them as well. I think fraudsters rarely simply defraud the public sector or the private sector. It is often the case that those with a propensity towards fraud will look at any channel for which they can gain financial or other benefit. And this is a very much narrowly facing bill. And again, we have to look at this in its broader context. And I'd question whether DWP could be doing more to share information with the private sector using existing powers to do so. There are plenty of voluntary information and data sharing schemes available to which DWP are not currently plugged in, and I think it would complement this particular power to be able to layer the data picture and layer the intelligence picture and not just look at this single piece of information in isolation. There will be a number of data points across the private sector that you can gain through voluntary data sharing schemes that DWP are currently not engaging with.
Rebecca Smith.
Thank you, Chair. Although we've just heard that serious organised fraud is only considered 10% of what is taken from the departments at the moment, do you think that the measures to give DWP investigators power of entry, search and seizure are the right approach to tackling that 10% of serious organised fraud that exists?
Absolutely. I think the point is well made by previous evidence that the police simply don't have the resources to even look at fraud against consumers, never mind support DWP. So I think it's entirely necessary to extend those powers of search and seizure to DWP as well. But again, I keep coming back to the broader context. There are other powers, and what we shouldn't do with this bill is assume that this is the sole answer. It's taken a very civil lens, quite necessarily, on what is a huge volume crime, which cannot be dealt with simply through a criminal justice response alone. We have to save that criminal justice response in a sort of surgical way and really use that for the really high-end cases, particularly in an organised crime sense. we shouldn't be seeing it as an either or. And what I'd not like to see from this is replacing the necessary deterrent of a criminal investigation and prosecution with pure use of civil measures. We need to use that full suite of powers beyond this bill, including those in the bills like the Proceeds of Crime Act that exist already, and standard issue fraud criminal prosecution. So something the independent oversight I'd like to see from that oversight is that we don't lose that criminal thread, and that we have to keep prosecuting where necessary and providing that necessary deterrent through all the available means and not just the ones available in this bill.
You mentioned that the PSFA powers are ones that are used generally, but they haven't been available to tackle fraud in the public sector outside of tax and welfare. So I wondered, what's your assessment of bringing these powers into this space? How effective are they going to be at tackling public sector fraud?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think it's a really necessary approach. However, I would caution that I see we are holding off from establishing the PFSA as a statutory body for now, and I can completely understand the reasons for that. We're in a very tight fiscal environment. The cost of setting up a new agency is substantial, and we do need to test the competence of the PFSA in doing so. However, I think in due course we need a more fixed timeline to move the PFSA off into a statutory body, just to at least remove any perception, if not actual political interference in investigations. I think that's a really important part. We need a stronger timetable. I know when the time is right that will happen, but I'd like to see a stronger timetable towards that. I think there will be at least a perception risk of executive overreach if the PFSA doesn't move in that direction more quickly than not.
I think that obviously the provision is in the bill to move the PSFA to be a statutory body. But as we were discussing earlier, they're built in the kind of current period is the independent chair and that oversight, and I just wondered if that offers reassurance of that oversight in the meantime.
There is somewhat of a question of kind of who guards the guards in some respect, and I think this bill is significantly built in oversight. I think at every step we see the building in of oversight. However, it depends who that independent chair is, and a question would be whether it could be the individual could be subject to a parliamentary approval process, as other oversight positions are, particularly if we look at the NAO model, for example. So it might be good to build in a sort of parliamentary approval process for the individual who will take that role.
I've got another one.
Oh, yeah, no, you.
And you also talked about the importance of training, and part of the reason why we're starting off quite small is to ensure that with the PSFA, because there are broader powers within there than under the DWP part of the Act, the powers to levy fines, and, for example, that these will be authorised officers who have training, who have to apply to courts to use search warrants and so on. So I suppose your kind of thoughts on how do we ensure that training and that expertise means that those 24 officers are, have the necessary expertise to be able to take on these powers?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think one that deserves more considered thought. These are, people have not gone through the police training process. I wonder if it's worth considering whether we make use of the powers contingent on being a financial investigator as accredited under the Proceeds of Crime Act. However, I make that suggestion with some caution, knowing that in a practical sense there's a national shortage of financial investigators across the country. We're hemorrhaging these individuals, which we train up in the public sector and go straight out to be poached by the financial sector, and probably to be responding to some of these measures set out in the bill. So I say so with some caution. However, that is a properly accredited and overseen process of skills. So either a financial investigator, or I think we need to look carefully about who exercises those powers, whether they need to go under an analogous police training programme. I think there is some consideration of the PIP programme, although they can't be officially accredited over time, they won't be using the powers as frequently as that process would require. But I think that's a part of the bill I'd like to see strengthened in some way, and perhaps incumbent on the government to look at what the other routes are beyond a financial investigator, to ensure the right level of competence in using what are very intrusive powers.
Minister, did you have a question?
Thank you. Just briefly on the question of efficacy and scale. So obviously HMRC have powers at the moment to request information from banks en masse, and I just wonder whether you feel that you know, given the experience that we have within government of doing that, and from what I can see, a lack of problem with that, and also the...
Alas, order. That brings us to the end of the time allotted to the Committee for Questions. Can I thank Helena Wood on behalf of the Committee for her evidence.
Thank you.
And we'll move on to the next panel. We'll now hear oral evidence from Kristin Jones, formerly of the Serious Fraud Office and the Crown Prosecution Service, and from Alex Rothwell, Chief Executive of the NHS Counter Fraud Authority. For this session, we have until 11 o'clock. Mike Wood.
Thank you, Sir Desmond. Perhaps I can start with the same question that I asked Helena Wood at the start of the last session. How well do you think this bill, as is currently drafted, strikes that balance between effectiveness and proportionality?
I think until we see the codes of practice and the operational guidance, and I'm sorry it's the same answer, so it's difficult to tell, because obviously I have operated in very regulated situations where there's been accountability, but without that extra information. I can't really say at the moment, but I think it's very important that when you interfere with the rights of the individual, that decisions are taken at a sufficiently high level by people with sufficient experience.
Is that your view as well?
Yeah, I mean, I'd echo Kristin's thoughts. I suppose there's nothing novel necessarily in this bill in relation to those powers exist elsewhere. So we've seen them in operation, and the ability to test and learn, which is baked into the proposals, I think is very helpful. So and I think importantly it addresses a need.
So there seems to be a theme emerging from this morning's witnesses that it's difficult to know whether the extensive powers that are in this bill are proportionate or not without knowing how they're going to be exercised. Would you expect those details that are planned for the code of practice to be on the face of the legislation?
Not on the face of the legislation necessarily, but I would expect perhaps certain commitments that the code of practice would cover certain areas in debate, perhaps.
So perhaps a draft code before Parliament makes definitive decisions as to the legislation?
Yes, or commitments as to safeguards that will be in the code of practice. And in terms of the measures in the bill and the powers to update them, do you think that they are currently sufficiently flexible to respond to the changing nature of fraud, as you've seen through your career, and what you would expect to continue in the years ahead? I do have some reservations, as has been expressed earlier, about corporates and when you're dealing with corporate organisations, because a corporate can't speak itself, it can only speak through its officers. And the bill at the moment only talks about notices, it doesn't talk about answering questions, and unless you're able to ask an officer of a corporate questions, it's quite difficult if it's just written answers through notices. So I do wonder if, when you're looking at the more serious end, whether there are sufficient powers there for dealing with the top end of public sector fraud.
Thank you. And Alex, perhaps you could just broaden out this discussion a little more by explaining some of the specific challenges that the NHS faces in identifying, investigating fraud, recovering sums of money, and how you would expect this bill to make a difference in that?
Perhaps a good example is, although we believe that we are losing something in the region of £1.3 billion a year to fraud, the amount of fraud that's actually identified, because a lot of the value we get is from prevention, from future prevention, the amount of fraud that's actually identified is relatively low. So, for example, in 23-24, I think the figure was something like 5.2 million. However, we only recovered 12% of that figure. There's a lot more value to be had, and I think this bill would be incredibly helpful for us to recover more money from people who've been suspected of fraud. Pursuing criminal justice outcomes in relatively low value cases, perhaps individuals who've taken £5,000, £10,000, have been exited through HR processes, for example, or have simply left the organisation, this gives us an incredible opportunity to recover more funds, and I think we would use it extensively.
And for both of you, do you think there's anything missing from the bill that would help in the fight against fraud? It would be appropriate to be in legislation like this?
Well, my only concern is my career has been dealing with fraud in the public and private sector, and I think it's important that when a fraud is investigated and you discover something that's not in your scope, that you are able to communicate that so that fraudsters are tackled, whether it's in the private or the public sector.
Yeah, it doesn't seem to me that the bill seems pretty comprehensive in terms of our requirements, but as we've already heard, that there are things that I have some concerns around training, not just of individuals who are exercising the powers, but also those who manage them and set the culture and tone of an organisation, how that's built in. I'd echo Kristin's comments about private sector providers. For example, in the NHS, we're increasingly seeing private sector providers providing NHS services. And so how would that be exercised? So I think it's more in the exercise of the powers than the extent of the powers from my point of view.
The other thing I think is missing compared to when other organisations have been established is that we only talk about investigators, and I'm a great believer in a multidisciplinary team with early legal advice and with accountancy advice as necessary, and with financial investigators. And so we have an organisation at the moment where we only define the role of the investigators.
Minister.
Thank you. I just wonder, I asked this question of the first panel, but interested both in broad terms and specifically within the parameters of your role in the NHS, whether you have seen changing attitudes to fraud in recent years. Obviously, there are various public attitude surveys that would indicate that is the case, but has there been an increasing prevalence of fraud that the NHS is having to contend with, and any comments on general changes in attitudes?
Well, I'd certainly echo your thoughts in terms of attitudes. I think we've seen that expressed in a number of different ways through surveys and Transparency International's Transparency Index, for example. In terms of statistics, we have seen our fraud prevalence rate remain fairly steady over the last 5 to 7 years. But it's a complex picture because I actually think we've been increasing our fraud protection measures as well. What we have seen, though, I think across the board is bitter pay disputes, a sense that contracts don't pay enough. We have extensive provider assurance programs that are recovering funds through what we classify as error. And I think I don't see any change in that climate necessarily. So opportunities to strengthen prevention for us are the most important factor, and to influence people's decision making before they commit fraud. So not necessarily in terms of statistics, but it is a huge concern to me. Yes.
During my career, I've seen sentences for fraud after prosecution increase dramatically, and I think that sends out a clear message. But also over my career, instead of only a few people being exposed to fraud, when you answer your telephone, there's a good chance you've got a scammer on the end at least once a week, if not several times a day. And if you're being targeted, it can be every mealtime they'll ring up and try while you're distracted and hope that you're going to fall for some con. So the worry is that the public is exposed so much to fraud that the seriousness of fraud gets watered down in their mind. And so you have these forums where you can recommend how you can claim various things from the government and how you can hit these sweet spots to get that benefit or that grant. So it has changed, and perhaps people aren't so shocked by fraud as they used to be.
If I may just ask one further question. So in considering this bill and discussing it with various people, various stakeholder groups, etc., the one thing that seems to come through incredibly strongly is the importance of data sharing as the single biggest thing that we can improve upon to tackle fraud. Firstly, I suppose a general question, would you share that view? And secondly, are there any organisations that we are not sharing data with or receiving data from at the moment who you think we should be, that would really help us to tackle fraud both within the DWP and more generally across the public sector?
Data sharing is critical to our ability to prevent fraud. We have a particular challenge in the NHS in that medical records are in a particular category, and therefore we're exempt from the economic the Transparency, the Digital Economy Act. So there's a particular challenge there. I'm not sure there's. I think perhaps I would focus in the first instance on the rich data sets that the government actually holds, and our ability to communicate inter-department, because those data sets are critical, and yet it is still challenging to obtain data, I would suggest. In many ways, the data protection legislation already provides the ability to share information, particularly where fraud is concerned, although the application of it is often quite risk-averse. I wish it had been called the Data Sharing Act and not the Data Protection Act, quite frankly.
I come from a slightly different angle on this, because having had many years prosecuting and had to deal with the Criminal Procedure and Investigation Act and the responsibility to gather material and go through it, I do think that it is very important, if you have data, to decide what you're going to do with it. And one thing, preparing for this committee, I looked at was the National Audit Office on the carers allowance, the report on that. And there you have a lot of data being gathered and passed, and if it's not addressed, discarded. And so for me, there's something important about, if you gather data, you do something with it. We've talked, there's been a lot of discussion around error. And it's important for the public that when they apply for something that they may not be entitled to, if that information is held, then just as if you apply for a passport and you fill the form in wrongly, you don't get your passport. It should be the same in other parts of government, that you should be able to rely on the information the state already held on you, the point about child benefit.
Cybercrime.
Thank you very much, Chair. I just wanted to go back to the question at the beginning that was asked of you on proportionality, because the previous witness, I think, really emphasised that it was the eligibility verification powers that she was concerned might go beyond proportionality and have the risk of additional intrusion. Is that, when you're commenting, are you commenting on those powers as well, or mainly on the other parts of the bill?
In terms of search warrants and...
Yes, so there's other powers that I think
to...
you mentioned do already exist and
Yeah.
are just being transferred to a new place where things are conducted.
Yeah.
Eligibility verification in the form that it's written is quite novel, and I just wanted to make sure that...
Does HMRC not have the ability to conduct those inquiries?
As inquiries, this is very routine use, though, I think, is the difference.
More extensive.
Yes.
Yeah.
So would you care to comment on the eligibility verification powers more specifically?
Well, I can see why there is concern. People have complex lives, and perhaps it isn't as straightforward as just how much capital is in a bank account at a particular time. I think those powers need to be exercised very carefully, and again, I go back to there is the opportunity to test and learn from this process through oversight is something that I'm reassured by, but I do recognise those concerns.
I think one of the difficulties is unlike, because I used to be in charge of international assistance when I was at the Serious Fraud Office, that whereas in other countries, you can go and there's a central bank register or building, so you can tackle that and find out all the accounts and individual holes. Here we don't, so there is it is more tricky when you're trying to verify financial information because there's no central register.
I think we're quite likely to. We were speaking before about is it flexible enough to cover future events? I think the way that we're using cash, if you like, or funds is changing in terms of digital currencies and so on. So, and the way that people hold value as well is changing.
Sorry, those last two comments are more about the effectiveness of the legislation than okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Desmond, and thank you both for sharing your experience and expertise with us this morning. It's estimated that there was about £5.4 billion worth of fraud and error in temporary COVID-19 schemes that were not run by HMRC. You all know that this is an area of significant public interest. The Public Accounts Committee said that it's very unlikely that most of the losses due to fraud and corruption during the pandemic will not be recovered. I wondered how far both of you agree with that statement by the Public Accounts Committee, and do you think that the new powers for the Public Sector Fraud Authority change these prospects?
Absolutely, I do think they change those prospects. I was still in law enforcement when COVID-19 was happening live, and there was an extensive discussion about the ability of the police to support investigations, and quite frankly, policing had significant challenges with fraud, still does, in terms of the volume of attacks, if you like, against individuals and businesses, which really made supporting the public sector almost an impossible ask. So I certainly welcome the ability to strengthen the public sector fraud response. In terms of whether that money will be recovered, I think there are some significant challenges, as I'm sure you're aware of. And I think it's right to apply a cost-benefit approach as well, although there's a moral imperative. We certainly look at things increasingly in a commercial sense and whether there is financial value in recovering funds.
It is very difficult to get money back from fraudsters, especially where it's organised, because the money disappears into different accounts in different names and overseas through lots of corporate bodies. So I think it will be a big challenge. But the important thing about this piece of legislation is that we're future-proofing it so that we, looking forward, we can learn from what has happened in the past and not repeat mistakes.
Thank you.
Chair. Interested particularly in the work that the NHS serious fraud team is doing already. What specific challenges do you face at the moment in investigating fraud and recovering money that this bill will help, but where also, through your experience, do you think there are gaps in what we're proposing or what's being proposed that could be tweaked or amended?
So I think if we take the view that fraud's already happened, because I've spoken about prevention before, once a fraud has happened, we've discovered it. I think there are increasingly limited opportunities to pursue criminal investigations. Certainly, although we maintain a strong investigative capability dealing with more serious types of criminality, we know about the challenges in the criminal justice system. The disclosure burden is high. It's incredibly expensive to run criminal investigations, and often they're taking 8 years or so or longer to reach fruition. So we're increasingly looking at what other, how else can we deal with fraud when it's presented to us, and in many ways it's the low value, high volume cases that we're seeing that are more challenging, where we're seeking to perhaps recover funds from someone who has taken £5,000. I think I mentioned that before. So I think this is where I have the most interest in this bill, because I think we would seek to use those powers extensively, and of course every penny that we recover is money that will be well spent in the NHS. So I don't necessarily see any gaps in this particular legislation. I think there are elements of the work that we do in the National Health Service that we would benefit from some more powers. But I think the focus here is obviously on the bill rather than our own ability. And a lot of that applies to medical records, for example, and how we access those.
Thank you very much. You've talked a little bit about the kind of the police pressures that exist, and I'd be really interested in kind of both of your assessment, given your experience of the police's capacity and ability to investigate public sector fraud at the moment, and what whether that means that there is more of a need for civil powers.
Shall I take that first? So absolutely. I think if I look across other international jurisdictions, often law enforcement agencies have quite distinctive public sector fraud or crime functions. The FBI, for example, has an extensive healthcare fraud capacity. I think the way that policing has evolved over the last 20 or 30 years, particularly with an emphasis on drug supply, knife crime, and firearms, has meant there's little capacity in policing to tackle public sector fraud. And of course, with an ever-present terrorist threat, which is changing very rapidly, and also safeguarding, and some of the figures the National Crime Agency have quoted publicly in terms of people who are at risk to children, for example. I think one of the challenges is that even if you invest more in fraud capability, when a crisis happens, policing has to flex perhaps more than other investigations, whether that's public order or some other form of crisis. And inevitably, crimes like fraud are easier to perhaps put on hold for a time. So I think what we've seen over the last, certainly since 2018, is a gradual professionalisation and increasing capability in the public sector, which I endorse. So I think there is a you could invest more in the police, but my concern is there will continue to be crises that affect policing that will impact the ability of policing to support the public sector in the way that is required.
Yeah, I agree with everything that Alex has just said, and the same applies to prosecution, that if you have specialist prosecutors where the resource is ring-fenced, they don't get dragged away, but if you have them in with other prosecutors, it depends what the pressure is at any particular time as to what resource is going to be given to fraud prosecutions.
Thank you, Chair. We've talked already about how there's increased public acceptability of fraud and attitudes towards towards that, and indeed the social media guides that are out there, you know, the how-to and presenting it as a victimless crime. So I wondered, along with improvements to investigating powers in the bill, what the bill will do to change that public narrative in its very existence.
So I think one of the things we've always struggled to do is put a value on deterrence. Because it's quite hard to categorically say that someone hasn't done something because of a change in approach to something. However, it's my view that once it is known there are increased powers in this space and individuals will be pursued for funds, I think we will see some behaviour change. And we could quantify that potentially. The challenge is directly relating it to the bill, particularly if you're introducing other measures at the same time. I think there's a powerful deterrent effect if it's exercised correctly and at scale, and the public can see the benefits of it.
Yes, I agree. I think if people know that there's an increased likelihood that they will be detected, then that will have an effect. And it's important as well to use similar means to get the right narrative across about what you should and shouldn't be doing.
Thank you.
George Gould.
I was interested in the point you made about future-proofing for future pandemics or crises. And I just wondered on both of your reflections on what you learnt from the COVID pandemic and whether you feel the bill kind of addresses what we need to do to ensure that we don't end up with the level of fraud we did during that pandemic.
I think we have to plan for emergencies. They will occur and inevitably, and that we should have the work kept up to date on that, so that you refer back to one you prepared earlier. I think that is so important, because when you've got an emergency, everybody is doing their best to get through it as fast as they can, and that isn't the time for slow consideration. Whereas now, after we've been through that experience, that's the time to reflect and document what we're going to do in the future.
I think fundamentally it's the loosening of controls and our understanding of the impact of the loosening of controls and the friction that's introduced or not introduced when you're addressing an emergency. I think we have a much better understanding of how that can manifest itself now as well. But I'm confident that this bill would enable an effective response to fraud.
And what do you see as the biggest threats in terms of fraud against the public sector at the moment? And if we have time, how the bill addresses those?
Well, I think from my perspective, it's the digital it's the footprint that is left, and our ability to analyse that at scale. There's very few transactions, if any, take place which do not have a digital or electronic footprint of some kind. And I think it's the data sharing and our capability to analyse that data is the most important factor. This bill goes some way to address that, but obviously elements of this bill are about responding to fraud once it's happened. That's the biggest challenge for me. But of course, on top of that is the safeguards that we put in place to ensure that our interpretation of that analysis is correct as well.
Has to accompany this, yeah.
Absolutely.
Very much agree.
Yes, I think increasingly in society today, it's knowing what the truth is can be the problem with the amount of data out there and false information out there.
If I could just ask a final question, Alex, in reference to something you said earlier about the level of fraud that you've seen remaining fairly static, but that you'd increased your prevention measures. Just what has been particularly effective of those new measures that you've stepped up?
So data analysis has been particularly effective, getting better at recording and reporting we now have a ubiquitous case recording system, for example, that exists across the National Health Service. But I think the greatest value we've seen so far has been in improved data analysis on large data sets that exist, for example, on national contracting. That's where I think the value lies in future.
And the partnership between the PSFA that already exists, is that working well? And
yes, it is. Yeah,
maybe you could comment on that.
I think, as I mentioned before, we've seen the professionalisation of fraud specialists has made huge inroads in terms of the acceptability of fraud professionals. Yeah. Particularly in a finance environment, we deal with audit committees and so on. And recognition that the government is taking fraud seriously, not just this government, but the previous government as well. So the direction that we've had from the Cabinet Office...
Order. That brings us to the end of the allotted time for the committee to ask questions. Can I thank the witnesses for their evidence, and we'll move on to the next panel. Right, for our final session this morning, we will hear oral evidence from Anna Hall, Corporate Director of Debt, and Christy McAleese, Debt Advice Strategy and Policy Lead, both from the Money and Pension Service. Rebecca Smith.
If you've been in the room, you're going to have heard quite a lot about the Code of Practice already, and we know that the bill requires the Secretary of State to lay a Code of Practice before Parliament on the new recovery powers in particular. What would you like to see in that Code of Conduct?
Yeah, so there's a lot of detail that needs to be worked through, the operational detail of how these powers will work, and the Code of Conduct is clearly going to be extremely important. Existing within government already is the Debt Management Vulnerability Toolkit and the Public Sector Economic Abuse Toolkit, both which have been set up by the cross-government and cross-debt advice sector fairness group. So we would like to see those existing systems really tailored for this bill and the recovery powers to make sure that the code that it's implemented really fairly. There's lots of detail in the Debt Management and Vulnerability Toolkit. It's really about making sure that every individual is treated really fairly, no matter how the debt has arisen. So we're really interested in, once a debt is owed to government, how is someone able to set up a sustainable repayment plan? How are they able to access free debt advice, get the support they need? Because regardless of how the debt has arisen, there's their ongoing expenses, their family. We need to make sure that there's not unintended consequences for wider society and their family and how that debt's recovered.
Great. Is there anything you want to...
Yeah, I think I would agree with what Anna has said. I think there's possibly also opportunities within the Code of Conduct to build on some of the good work that the Department of Work and Pensions has already been doing around its ways of working with the debt sector. So really good kind of consistent signposting and referrals through to free debt advice. If, as seems reasonable, someone who's maybe contacted by the department then seeks advice from the sector, and then also some things around the acceptability of the debt sector, the advice worker being able to act on behalf of the person, so kind of third-party forms of authority. If we could look at that, that would really both streamline the process for the person in debt, but also actually make it much easier for the debt sector to work with the department. So there's probably some things in that area as well.
Great. I'll keep going if that's okay. And who should be consulted on in terms of putting that Code of Conduct together or Code of Practice together? And should that particular detail and the Code of Practice in particular be included on the face of the bill itself?
Yeah, so I think we can talk to who should be consulted, I think. So debt advice organisations, consumer groups, really important because they'll be the ones who are interacting and really supporting individuals in how they set up those repayment plans and interact with the debt that they owe to government. At the Money and Pension Service, we have an advisor panel and we convene the debt advice sector and creditors and everyone who kind of interacts in the ecosystem of debt advice, so we can certainly support with that. We've been really pleased with how the DWP officials have engaged with us so far. They're clearly really prioritising the people that are likely to be vulnerable, and we're working with them on an ongoing basis, and we expect to continue that through the Code of Conduct development.
Just to add briefly, we have track record of doing kind of consultation exercises in this area, and we've been sharing some of those learnings with colleagues at DWP. I think particularly, as Anna referenced, our debt advisor panel, which is made up of frontline advice workers from right across the sector, it's been a really valuable forum for us to understand how particular aspects of work that we're doing and kind of wider government work really impacts on the sector, and particularly on people in debt. And colleagues at DWP have already been discussing with how they can interact with that panel as kind of part of the process as well, which we'd really welcome.
Brilliant. I've got one more question, if I may, Chair. A slightly different tack, but we know that one of the powers within the bill is to disqualify a debtor from holding a driving licence. Do you think that that is likely to be an effective tool to getting people to engage and comply? And also, do you think the amount of time that it's for is long enough? Because it doesn't feel very long to me, given that it's supposed to be a deterrent. But do you think it's too long, too short, or we should just not be looking at and using something else instead?
Yeah, so I guess one of the things that we know quite a lot about the Money and Pension Service is how people in debt, how they behave, and they don't always necessarily behave in a particularly rational manner, the way that you might expect people to behave, as with all people interacting with systems. It can be incredibly overwhelming to have multiple debts. And so if you kind of draw an analogy to other types of debts that people might owe, say mortgage arrears or rent arrears, the fact that you might lose your home if you don't pay it is obviously an effective deterrent. So for some people, those kinds of consequences are an effective deterrent. But we see day in, day out in the services that we fund that people leave it right to the last minute before they seek help. Some people don't seek help at all, and there can be all kinds of reasons for that. It could be it's something to do with them, so they may struggle with literacy, they may have really overwhelming mental health issues. It could be that they just do not know what to do, and they also could be that they don't know where to seek help from. So it will be a deterrent, I'm sure, for some people, but for other people, deterrents aren't really the reason that they don't engage with the system. What we really think is really important is that the systems that are set up once a debt has arisen is really encouraging and supportive and help people to engage with the department so that they can set up an affordable and sustainable repayment plan. That will obviously minimise the number of people that get to that point. And there's lots of ways that we have experience of working with the finance sector and also with other government departments who are trying to recover debt, where if you really focus on being supportive, encouraging, really creating the environment for that frontline staff are someone that you would want to disclose information to and really set up that kind of income and expenditure, get a signpost to debt advice, those kinds of things. If that's inherent in the system, then you won't need that kind of deterrent very often. But just to say, there are huge numbers of people who are very vulnerable, who have multiple debts, and deterrents really aren't the thing that will impact on their ability to engage.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Desmond. Just on the final point that you made there, Anna, around engagement with customers, I wondered if you could set out a little bit about the partnership that the department has with yourselves and the Money Helper Service, and the work that's done there to ensure that we do seek to wrap appropriate advice and support around those who are indebted to the department.
Yeah, so we work with the department in a number of ways, and one of the most recent initiatives that we've had is working with Job Centre Plus colleagues to embed the Money Advisor Network referral system into that. So that means that where people are presenting at Job Centre Plus for a variety of reasons and they are identified as having some kind of debt or money difficulty, they can either be referred to the Money Helper website, which is the Money and Pension Service website, which has a variety of information on money, debt and pensions, or they can get a referral through the Money Advisor Network to one of our funded debt advice providers, and it's as seamless as possible, and it really enables someone who perhaps presents not realising that there's help out there. Obviously it's great that when someone interacts with the system that they kind of have to interact with, if we can then offer a real kind of range of support then that allows them to get to debt advice as quickly as possible. And I probably would say this, wouldn't I? But debt advice can be absolutely life-changing for people. The impact of it is huge. And so quite often, one of the things that we know is that people don't know debt advice exists. There's a huge number of people who would benefit from debt advice. They don't know where to look. They don't know how to find it. They think it maybe isn't for them. They don't know what will happen when they get debt advice. So if you've got someone reassuring at the job centre saying, this is a really independent, trusted service and it can help you sort out your financial affairs, and here's a seamless transfer through to that debt advice service, that can be incredibly effective. And we're really working with the department in Job Centre Plus and across the board on where people are particularly vulnerable and they really need that support before they can even start to think about finding work or engaging with other things. If you're worried about whether you've got food and whether you've got money coming in and what you're going to do about the bailiff that's knocking on your door, you really need to deal with that before you can look at your long-term future. So the department and all the officials that we've been working with have been really prioritising that, and we're obviously, being an arm's length body of the Department of Work and Pensions is really helpful to make those connections, and really embedding debt advice into all those systems has been really welcomed by the department.
Thank you. I mean, I'm really encouraged by what you've said about the engagement that you've had with the department on how we make the bill workable and supported, but also very much agree with your comments around the support and encouragement available for people to reach out to Money Helper and others. I absolutely agree with that. I just wanted to ask you to reflect on the way that we have structured the process for people to engage with the department when they are notified that they owe us a debt, because we have done everything that we can to structure this as a power of last resort. Do you think that is as robust as it can be, the multiple points of contact, the attempt to agree a sustainable and affordable repayment plan, the ability even after we've agreed a deduction for somebody to come back to the table and to negotiate that with us? Is there anything else that you'd like to see in that space, or do you think that's robust in reassuring ourselves that it is a power of last resort?
So it certainly looks that way from the detail that's in the bill. As others have said, the code of conduct will be the really critical thing. So one of the things is, if frontline staff aren't picking up vulnerabilities, or they're not trained in how to sort out affordability, or they're not trained in kind of empathic listening and all of the different ways of there's lots of protocols on how to have different types of conversation with people in different types of vulnerable situations. If those things aren't in place, then some of the processes within the bill won't be as effective. So it comes down to, I think, training for frontline staff, the capacity and processes then to follow up on what's actually been disclosed, that will enable those repayment plans to get put in place before those later processes. If those aren't in place, then that could cause some real issues, I think. But the code of conduct, as many have said, is where the real how successful this will come down to.
I think, I would agree with what Anna has said. I think, there's probably parallels here with what's happened within the financial services sector and kind of changes due to consumer duty and other kind of requirements there. I think they've found that it is kind of embedding that culture in the kind of frontline staff, in recovery staff, making sure that they are trained effectively. So kind of the process on paper needs to kind of be brought to life. And again, we've been really assured from the kind of colleagues that we've been speaking to at DWP so far that that's kind of in their thinking, and they've really demonstrated a willingness with us to kind of learn what they can from kind of how it's approached within the debt advice sector as well. So I think we're reassured on that.
Thank you. And just a final question from me. Anna, very early on in what you said, you talked about the importance of everybody being treated fairly, and I absolutely agree with that. Would you accept that one of the principal drivers for us acting in this way is an inherent unfairness in the system at the moment, that we're able to directly deduct from benefit claimants and those paid through PAYE means, but we're not able to do so from those who receive their income in other ways? And I guess just your reflection on whether you think it's appropriate that, from a fairness perspective, we look to take powers to be able to do that as well.
So I think we understand the intent of the DWP to ensure that debts can be recovered across all the different groups of people that might owe money. I think we are really focused on what happens when that debt arises and how people are treated in that situation. So it's probably slightly outside of our remit to comment on some of what you just outlined. But once the debt has arisen, then we would look at how people are treated fairly in that situation across the board.
Agreed. Yeah. Thank you.
Are there any further questions? There being no further questions, can I thank the witnesses for their evidence and invite the Government Whip to propose the adjournment.
Thanks. Move that the committee to now adjourn.
The question is that further consideration of the bill be now adjourned. As many of that opinion will say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. The ayes have it. Order, order.